Okay, class, so we are back. So I've already explained this observational study. Hello, hello. You are with me, eh? Okay. You don't have any questions, eh? You don't have any questions. Okay, okay. So then you can mute your mics, eh? Mute your mics. Okay. So observational studies. We have the cross-sectional study, the cohort studies, and the case control studies. We'll tackle them one after the other. So cross-sectional study, like I said, it's a study about prevalence. Prevalence means that the percentage of something in something, like the percentage of HIV cases in Upper East compared to the other 16 regions in Ghana, to find out which one is the highest. So this one is a cross-sectional study. So what is the prevalence of diabetes in this community? So it's an example. Here you draw a random sample of people and record information about their health in a systematic way or manner. You can also compare people with and without diabetes in terms of characteristics. So when I was doing my research, I used with those women with anemia and women without anemia. Like I said, I took 200 anemic women and 200 non-anemic women. So you can also compare people with and without diabetes in terms of characteristics, such as being overweight. That may be associated with the disease. Okay, so let me read this one too. The problem is that you cannot be sure which came first. So with cross-sectional studies, you cannot infer causation. You cannot say that the intake of alcohol leads to liver cirrhosis. No, cross-sectional study will not give you that. Cross-sectional study just gives you a test of hypothesis. Cross-sectional study just gives you a test of hypothesis. So with cross-sectional study, you are just looking at hypothesis testing. So what do you call it? You are just cross-sectional study just looks at what what do we call it? Association. So association. So cross-sectional study just looks at testing for associations. So let's say giving birth. You see, women, most of the women, they are slim, but when they give birth, they start becoming fat. So some of the men want to marry slim women. They advise that, marry a slim woman, because woman there, when she deliver 1, 2, 3, they will become very fat. So you the man, your interest is not in a slim woman. You like fat women or plus women. Instead of you to go for a plus woman, you say no. They say if I go for a slim woman, she will become fat. What if you go for a slim woman, she doesn't become fat? Then you start fighting with her, because your taste is for slim women. It's not for your taste is for fat women. It's not for slim women. You understand? So it is just an association. People are just saying, if you go and marry a slim woman, one day she will become fat. So there's no need to go and marry a fat woman, who, when you marry her, she will become fat and she will become deformed. But these ones are just associations people have tested. They have not inferred causation, or they have not established causal links, or they haven't established causal association. They haven't they've just found they haven't established causal association or causation. They've just tested for association, but they haven't said that when you marry a slim woman, she will one day become fat after delivery. It's not a fact. It's not something that people are just saying it, but we don't know whether the reverse is true, whether when you marry a fat woman, she will also end up becoming slim after giving birth, or when you marry a fat woman, she will continue to be fat like that and she will not change. So these ones are testing for association. But if you say we are establishing causation or finding causal relationship, that means that it has been proven that intake of salt will lead to what? Hypertension. That one everybody knows it. So that is a causal relationship, causal or causation. The excessive intake of salt leads to hypertension. So that is called causation. So for observational, I'm on slide 11. So the problem is that the problem is that you cannot be sure or know which came first, whether diabetes or overweight, because some are saying that weight causes diabetes. That means if you are fat, you are predisposed to type 2 diabetes. Some are also saying that, but you cannot determine whether the diabetes is the one that caused the person to become fat, or the weight that caused the person to get the diabetes. So that is what so with cross-sectional study, you just test for associations, but you cannot draw firm conclusions on causal relationship, or what caused this, which one came first and led to this. So cohort studies, most Ghanaians, clinicians, laboratorians, biomedical scientists, lecturers, this is the study that they conduct for PhD, masters and others. So cohort studies is a longitudinal study. It's also an observational, because you don't go inside to influence the study. You don't provide an intervention. You don't cause any disease. So that is cohort studies. So initially I explained what a cohort study is. I said that it's a longitudinal. Anytime you hear cohort study, it's either a prospective or longitudinal study, or a retrospective study. Retrospective study means that you are going back. So let's say today is 18th of March 2023. So if you want to carry out a study to determine the dynamics of sickle cell or of HIV for the past 10 years, then you go to the hospital and pick, but you take ethical approval before, then you go to the hospital and pick their hospital registers, folders and others, and you prepare a form we call an abstraction form. So use an abstraction form. An abstraction form is used only for retrospective studies. So abstraction form is what? A questionnaire. Another name for abstraction form is a questionnaire that we use to collect information for retrospective studies. But if the study is not a retrospective study, but you are going to come into contact with the patient himself or herself, then it becomes a questionnaire. So we use questionnaire if you have access to the patient, but if you don't have access to the patient, we use abstraction form. So that you design an abstraction form, go to the hospital, look for information on patients for the last 10 years on malaria or HIV or Ebola or COVID-19. Most of those patients may have been dead. Some have migrated to America, Canada, and they are not there to answer questions, but their information is in the hospital. So you can get their information from the hospital. So this one brings to mind that for questionnaire, if the patient is there, you use questionnaire to take information from the patient. So if you are using questionnaire to take information from the patient, the kind of information you'll be taking from the patient is called a primary data. Then if the patient is absent For instance, for retrospective study, you are looking back. You start from today and look back for the next 10 years and get a data on. You can define the number of years you want, but it should be in the past. Look for data on Ebola, COVID-19, or anything. So with this kind of study, the kind of data you are going to look for is called a secondary. It's called a secondary data. So the kind of data you'll be looking for over here is a secondary data. So you are going to do a secondary data analysis. So you use an abstraction form. Your questionnaire for the retrospective study is an abstraction form, and the questionnaire for observational studies, that you are observing the participants, you take information from them, you interview them, that the questionnaire you use is called a questionnaire. And the participants are not there to answer you. Some have migrated, some are dead. It's a retrospective 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or 5 years ago. You go and take the information from the hospital registers, from the LIMS and the DIMS and whatever. You use an abstraction form to pick retrospective studies. And the data that you are going to pick is called secondary data. But if the patient is standing in front of you and you are taking information, asking him questions, taking information from his folders and asking him questions and other, that becomes a primary data. Primary data. Okay, so we finished cross-sectional study. We are on cohort study. So I guess you all understand what. So longitudinal study is the same as a prospective study. So let me make it like this. Longitudinal study is the same as a prospective study. So retrospective study is a historical. You look back to see what happened in the past. When you combine, you can combine retrospective study, look back the last 5 years, and also 5 years from now. For instance, if you are doing a study for the last 5 years, if you look at, you take data from the last 5 years, data from the last 5 years, data from the last 5 years, versus data from today to the next 5 years. That's future. This study design will become what? You are looking back from the reference point is today. So 5 years ago becomes retrospective. Then 5 years from now to the future becomes prospective. So this one becomes retrospective, prospective, or retrospective longitudinal study. So you can marry more than one study design. So you can have more than one study design. So this retrospective longitudinal, retrospective prospective study is just a study design for one experiment. So you can put together a cross-sectional case control study. It becomes a study design. Depending on your resources, you can marry the study designs. Okay, so let's look at the characteristics of a cohort study. So when we say longitudinal study, retrospective study, they all fall under cohort study. So when you say a cohort means a group of people who an experiment is going to be conducted on. They are just a cohort, but we just use it to explain whether it's longitudinal or prospective. It's still a cohort. But a cohort is just a group of people you are going to do an experiment on. It's like the participant, but participant is only one. So if participant becomes plural, it becomes participants. So the plural form of the participants becomes what? A cohort. And most of the cohort is you do a follow-up on them, so it becomes a cohort. So characteristics. The study starts with people free of the disease I've explained already, using the gestational diabetes method. The women, there are some women, they don't have diabetes, but anytime they become pregnant, along the course of their gestation, they develop gestational diabetes. So the person for cohort study, you should start without the condition. Then along the course of the pregnancy, you develop the condition. So some of the examples of those conditions are gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, then gestational diabetes. So anytime we add gestational to them because they are pregnancy associated conditions. Then we assess exposure at baseline. So at baseline, we look, that's the starting point when they didn't have the condition. We look at the factors that influence them. Like at the baseline, the factors that they had, or their exposures, what they were exposed to, which made them not to have the condition. And when they became pregnant too, we have to assess the factors at follow-up that caused them to develop the condition. So when they didn't have the condition, what was their blood pressure? When they didn't have the condition, were they attending hospital or antenatal care as frequent as possible? Then when they developed the condition, what made them develop the condition? Is it that their husband was disturbing them? Is it that they were stressed up because they were pregnant and writing an exams? So the stress propagated or caused them to develop the gestational hypertension or gestational diabetes. So you look at all those exposures. Exposures are just called predictors. Exposures are predictors. Anytime you hear exposures, they are the factors that cause a disease is associated with. We call them predictors. Predictors. They are also called independent variables. They are also called independent variables. They are also called risk factors. Risk factors. So what are the risk factors or causes of the disease? They are also called, their main, this thing is called exposures. They are called exposures. So what are the exposures associated with you developing hypertension or diabetes or cancer? What are the factors? The predisposition factors. So these ones are called exposures. So anytime you hear exposures along the course of the lecture, you have to understand that there are factors that are associated with the disease. So we finished this. So we assess exposure at baseline, or the predictors of the factors that cause the disease at baseline, and also assess the exposure status at follow-up. For prospective cohort study, so if you have a population, we have the sample without the disease. So we have some have the factor that causes the disease, or some have the condition, some do not have the disease. So we have the, so whenever you see outcome, the outcome is what? Did you get the end results of you being exposed to something? So we say begin inquiry here and work forward. So population, this is the participants or the study cohort. Okay, so sample people without the disease. So we get the people without the disease, then we look at, so I said that prospective study, the people who, the participants should be without the disease, so they are without the disease. Then so alongside, when we follow them up, some will have the exposures or the factors or the predictors, especially if you are looking for lung cancer. So the outcome of a disease, or is the end results. outcome is the end result or the disease. So you see, some have the exposure or the risk factors. For instance, if you are smoking, you are always eating late at the like you eat late before you sleep, you are predisposed to hypertension and diabetes. If you smoke, you are predisposed to lung cancer. So some have the factor, then some do not have the factor. So those who drink alcohol can get liver conditions, and the controls are those who don't drink alcohol. So when you see C is what? Those who were exposed or have the risk factors, those who drank alcohol, those who do not, those who drank alcohol, those who smoke, they were associated with the risk factor. And those who did not drink alcohol, they didn't smoke, they were without the risk factor. So with those who develop alcohol, those who smoke, some are lucky that they will not develop lung cancer. Those who drink alcohol, some have been drinking alcohol, they end up getting 90 years of age. But some just drank alcohol for a short time and they develop liver condition. So some will develop the disease, some do not develop the disease. Those who did not smoke, those who did not drink alcohol, some also ended up getting hypertension from other factors, getting lung cancer, that is if he didn't smoke, getting this. But and also some had the disease, some did not smoke, were not exposed to the exposure, and still they didn't still also have the disease. But some did not smoke, some did not take in alcohol, some did not eat late in the night, they didn't develop the condition. But some did not do all these things, but they were unlucky and they still developed heart problem, diabetes, lung cancer from other causes which our study was not able to find out. So that is a prospective study. So for a prospective study, you start the study population without the disease, then when they are without the disease, and we have people who were exposed to the condition, were exposed to the factors that can cause the condition, and others who were not exposed to the factors that can cause the condition. And those who were exposed to the factors that can cause the condition, some ended up having the disease, but some were very lucky they didn't get the disease. Those who were not exposed to the factors that cause the condition, still some developed this same condition, but some did not also develop it. So that's prospective cohort study. So when do we conduct a cohort study? When there is good evidence of exposure and disease. So the risk factors should be there. The risk factors that give people lung cancer should be there. That when you smoke you can get lung cancer. But if there is no risk factor, we cannot associate that condition with any risk factor, then you cannot conduct a cohort study. Another reason why we conduct a cohort study is when exposure is rare, but incidence of disease is higher among exposed. When we talk about incidence is what? New cases of a disease. So incidence is what? New cases. New cases. For instance, what is the incidence of COVID-19? COVID-19 in Upper East. What is the incidence of COVID-19? COVID-19 in Upper East. Upper East. So incidence, you have to also bring the time in Upper East for 2022 annual projections. Annual projections. So we say, 2022 COVID-19 cases, and anytime you hear incident, is the new cases. So in 2022, we ended up having, there can be in 2022 there can be already, maybe if there were already 50 cases COVID-19, 50 cases were already there, and the 50 cases came from 2020, 2021, 2022. When you add them up to what is up to 2022, was what? 50 cases of COVID-19. 50 cases of COVID-19. But you realize that in the month of December, of 2022, the month of December of 2022, the cases of COVID-19 shot up. So month of December, in December of 2022, we had 10 new cases of COVID-19. So the new cases that we get in a specific time is what you call incidence. So incidence is what? New cases. Then prevalence is both new and old cases. So prevalence takes into account, prevalence is equal to new cases plus old cases. So Mr. Abudai, turn on your mic and answer this question for me. Hello? Hello, class? Mr. Abdullah? Mr. Abdullah, answer this question for me. Is he around? Is Mr. Abdullah? Is Abdullah around? Mr. Abdullah, answer this question for me. I'm coming to ask you. So turn your mic on. Isaka, off your mic. Okay, so let's start. Oh, Isaka, off your mic. Mr. Abdullah, you can turn off your mic when you're about to answer, then you on it. So let me ask my question. Okay, so Mr. Abdullah, prevalence is both new cases and old cases. So in the year 2022, from January 2022, from January to November, we had 45 cases of COVID-19. Then in the month of December in 2022, we had 10 cases of COVID-19. So what is the prevalence of COVID-19 in 2022? Mr. Abdullah, time is going. I'm recording. That will be 55. Okay. Well done. What is the incidence? What is the incidence of COVID-19 in 2022? Mr. Abdullah. The incidence. Okay, class, who can answer that? What is the incidence? 10 cases. Okay. 10 cases. Okay. Okay, so that means that the prevalence, you have to add the incidence and the old cases. So prevalence has to do with old cases and new cases. But the prevalent incidence is only new cases. Okay, so you have all done well. Thank you very much. Let's continue. We'll finish right now. Just need to walk you through, because you have to get the concept so when you are reading. Okay, so when do we conduct a cohort study? When, please off your mic. When do we conduct a cohort study? When exposure is rare but incidence of disease is higher. When the risk factors, for instance, in 1983, HIV, the incidence was there, but we didn't know what causes HIV. Any new disease will come, incidence can be high, it can be spreading, but you may not know what is causing the disease. So it becomes what? The risk factors are not there. So we have to conduct a cohort study, a follow-up study, and follow the disease and see the dynamics of the disease. And that is a follow-up studies. So when follow-up is easy, cohort is stable. So whenever there is a follow-up study, you have a follow-up study, and the cohort is stable. Stability of cohort means that they are not traveling up and down. Somebody can get a job at, for instance, Upper West. We have Listowell, who is in Upper West, who has joined your class, who will be joining your class very soon. He's even got So if somebody is conducting a study in Upper West Regional Hospital, today when the person goes there, he cannot get any information from Listowell, because Listowell is doing a course in Bolga Technical University. So today, when you go for head count or to take information from him, you will not find him, because the cohort is not stable. But if you have a cohort or people you are working with who are stable, then you will not get any losses to follow up. Losses to follow up is very important. These are one of the problems we have in research. If you have losses to follow up, you are following the person up, then you realize that the person will get a job somewhere. I will not. Next time when you come, you are searching for the woman, you will not find her again, because he and the husband have migrated to another place, or there is war in Boku. So if you are doing a study in Boku, you will not, your cohort will not be stable, because everybody has run away from Boku. So your study has now come to a standstill. Okay, so when there is ample money, because cohort study requires a lot of money to conduct. Okay, so general considerations while selection of cohorts. Both cohorts are free of the disease, like I said at first. Both groups should equally be susceptible to the disease. So your control and the cases should all be susceptible. No, for the cohort, you begin without a condition. So if you are starting with two groups of people, that's the control group, and you can start with people and follow them up. So if you want hypertension, you pick two groups of people who don't have the condition. Then both of the groups should be able to be susceptible to the disease, or should be able to develop the condition along the course of pregnancy or along the course of their being in the study. So both groups should be comparable. So the cohort, the cases, and the control should be comparable. Diagnostic and eligibility criteria, the laboratory test you are using. For me, the anemia, I use hemoglobin cutoff point of 10. So it should apply to the cases and to the control. You should have the same criteria for diagnosis of the condition. So if you are having anemia, I diagnose you as anemia if you have hemoglobin concentration lower than 10. If you are non-anemic, you should have hemoglobin concentration higher than 10. So if I was supposed to follow up these women from the time of the beginning of the study, then these women should not have the condition. They shouldn't be anemic. Then I'll follow them up until they become anemic. And I use that diagnosis criteria of having HB of 10 or lower than 10 or higher than 10 to classify them as controls, and also to classify them as cases. So, elements of cohort study. Selection of study subjects is very important. Obtaining data on the exposure or the risk factors is very important. Selection of comparison group, that's the control group, is very important. Follow up is very important because you have to follow them up. If it's a pregnant woman, then first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, you follow them up, pick information, pick their blood sample, and look at the level of some markers that are, maybe if you are looking for nitric oxide, look at level of nitric oxide in them that is causing them to develop hypertension. You look at all those things, and we do your analytical testing also. So still on selection of study subjects, we look at from the general population. If you are considering the general population, look at the whole population in an area, or that is if you have money to look at all the people in Bolga, go around following them up. It's not possible. You may not have money to do all, so you just pick a sample. If you have 1,000 people living in Bolga, you can just pick about 100 based on your sample size calculation. You pick about 100, then whatever finding you found in the 100 people, you extrapolate them to the 1,000 people in the population. So you look if you have a special group of population you are looking at, you look at the selected group, the occupation of the group, or the professional group. So if you are looking at laboratory personnel in Bolgatanga Regional Hospital, then you look at them and maybe you can compare them to laboratory personnel in Tongo Hospital and see which of them is stress or under stress. I know that for my hypothesis, those working in Bongo Hospital, they don't even do night, so they are less stressed than those working in regional hospital. But those working in regional hospital, they have accommodation, they have incentive, they have TB, tuberculosis money, they are chopping nyafun. So they are also happy. They are stressed out, but they are very, very happy. So you look at exposure groups also. Persons having exposure to some physical, chemical, or biological agents. So for instance, you look at X-ray exposure to radiologists. So when you are looking at selecting your study subjects, you look at people who have the risk factors and they are exposed to these things, and those who are not exposed to them, you look at them and compare between the two of them and look at their blood levels of some particular biomarkers. Obtaining data on exposure. So this is how we obtain data. You can conduct an interview, personal interviews, or you can send them, you can email questionnaires to them, like the way on the platform they bring Google Forms. Fill out these Google Forms for me. Somebody is conducting a study in KNUST, and the person has developed this Google form. You come and put on GAMS platform and say, fill it for me. Some of the time when they bring it, ask them that they should bring their compensation. You cannot be filling. That means you are the participant. What are they giving you? Okay, but that's just by the way. So we can review hospital records. So review of hospital records, that's the dose of drug, radiation, type of surgery. All these things form part of a way to get subjects or to recruit subjects, or getting the information. Okay, we are on data. So when you are abstracting data, you use your personal interviews. You can email or post the questionnaire to the participants for them and be asking them, and they will fill it and send it to you. Or some of the time you develop some app on your phone so that you go around and asking the questions, or you develop Google form and send it to a page and say everybody should fill it for me. Or you can review hospital records too, or medical examination or special test. So you can go about, see the patient, you can see the patient and conduct blood pressure, then serum cholesterol levels and all that things for the patient, and compare between the controls and the test. Environmental survey. By obtaining data on exposure, we can classify cohorts as exposed and non-exposed. By degree of exposure, we can sub-classify cohorts. Selection of comparison group. So For the comparison group, we can have internal comparison group, that is only one cohort involved in a study. So the group of people, we can just have one people, that's internal comparison group. That is when we take baseline information on those who don't have the condition, then when they develop the condition, we take their results and compare the results as baseline and the results when they develop the condition. That gives us an internal comparison group. So we can subclassify. Okay, so we can subclassify them like how I've explained. So when we subclassify, we will have what the baseline group, and also when you develop the condition, they will compare. So with this, we are going to use the what do we call it? This kind of t-test. We have the independent t-test, then we have the is it the paired t-test or so? So we compare. Then the external comparison means that more than one cohort in the study for the purpose of comparison. So cohort of radiologists compared with ophthalmologists. So with this, you can compare nurses and laboratory personnel and see which of them is very happy with conditions of service in Ghana Health Service. So this one, we have the external comparison group. If you are looking at laboratory personnel, then the nurses are going to be the external comparison group because they don't belong to the same profession. We also look at comparison with general population. So we can take, if no comparison group is available, we can compare the rates of study cohort with general population. For instance, your study, you conducted a study on prevalence of hypertension in Upper East, and you couldn't get anywhere to compare any other study to compare your study to. Then you compare it with a study done by prevalence of this thing by World Bank or World Health Organization. They did a study in Ghana, the whole of Ghana. So what you did in the Upper East, you compare it with what you did in the whole of Ghana. That becomes comparison with the general population. Especially cancer rate of uranium minus with cancer in general population. So rate of hypertension in Upper East versus rate of hypertension in Ghana conducted by World Health Organization. So your study becomes rate of hypertension in Upper East because you are limited in your resources or your funds. But the one done by World Health Organization, you are going to compare your own with it. So follow up. Why do we follow up? We follow up to obtain data about outcome to be determined. So the outcome to be determined can be disease or no disease, or so the disease is the morbidity and death is called mortality. So mailed questionnaire. So we can send the questionnaire to them. When you put it on the platform, it's also part of the mailed questionnaire. Or even instead of you collecting the questionnaire, you can just call the participants by telephone call and be asking them questions. Or you can go to them and be interviewing them one by one. You can be doing periodic medical examination for them. So first trimester, you did medical examination, you did blood pressure, you took their blood sample. Second trimester, you go back and do the same. Third trimester, you do the same. Then you also review hospital records about the patient. Look at the patient folder, delivery registers, and other things. You survey the death records also. That's what killed the person. You look at the cause of death, and other events that led to the person's death. Then the follow-up is most critical part of the study. So like I explained, some laws to follow up, like if you are doing your master's degree in Bawku Presby Hospital, and the war came, the civil war came, that means that you lose all your, if you are conducting longitudinal study there, you are going to lose all your participants to follow up, because they will migrate and go to Bolga. So when you go and you are following them, you can't follow them. So you started with 500 people, you will end up with only 2 people. But the two people said they are even about to even also go and join the people in Bolga. So you realize that your study comes to a standstill. So some losses to follow up is inevitable due to death change of address, migration, change of occupation. Loss to follow up is one of the drawbacks of the cohort study. So we have incidence rate of outcome. So this is a 2x2 table. And this one is what we use to calculate the relative risk or the odds ratio. So for the longitudinal horizontal axis, we have those who had the disease. So the disease status, exposure status. So those with the disease, we say yes, and they belong to this one. Those without the disease, they are no, they belong to B and D. Then those who had the risk factors, like those who were smoking and they had lung cancer, we have what? This horizontal axis, the row, this A and B. And those who were not having the risk factor, they were not smoking, they were also mommy, they didn't smoke, they didn't drink alcohol, they are what? C and D. So we have those with the disease on the horizontal, those without the disease, those with the exposure status, and those without the exposure status on the vertical axis. So over here we total study cohort, we have A and B, A plus B being those with the disease, then C plus D being the comparison group or the control. Here to A plus C, we just add them, B plus D. Okay, so let's go. So incidence, we are going to calculate incidence, that are the new cases. So if you want to have new cases of HIV for 2023, then we are going to consider from January to March. So the new cases will be what? A is those with the disease over A plus B. And so A plus B is the total, because for the disease status we have those who had the disease. So if we have about 50 people in Bolgatanga, and out of these 50 people, 10 people get HIV, then 40 people will not get HIV. So if you want to find the incidence, then it will be the 10 people who had the HIV plus 10 people who had the HIV over the total population of the sample. So 10 plus 40 being 50, which is the total population, and those who had the case, which is what? 10 had HIV. So that would be A over A plus B. So let's go. So that would be A over A plus B. That's the incidence among exposed. The incidence among unexposed are those without the condition, who develop the condition or not. So those without the exposure is what? The risk factor. So those without the risk factors, who had the disease or not. So let's see. So those with the disease, we have yes. So those with the exposure, so this one, they were not having the exposure. So C does not have the exposure. So C over C plus D gives us the incidence among those who didn't. So the C had the disease, all right, but it was not exposed to the factors that can cause the disease. She didn't smoke cigarette or cocaine or anything, but she ended up getting the disease. So it was without exposure but still ended up getting the disease. So we call those people the comparison cohort, or incidence among the unexposed. So we have incidence among the non-exposed group. So if you want to calculate the relative risks for epidemiologists or for a cohort study, most of the time we look at relative risks or RR. We can use it to calculate the hazard ratio or hazard rate. But if you come to case control study, we'll be using the odds ratio to calculate for the level of exposure or the odds of a disease. So case control study uses odds ratio to determine severity or effect a disease model. Effect estimate. So if you want to estimate the effect or find the severity of a disease, we use a case control study, we use odds ratio. But for longitudinal study or for longitudinal or prospective study or cohort study, we use relative rates. So the relative risk calculation is the same as the odds ratio, but we use relative rates for the longitudinal. So we use relative rate and odds ratio for case control study. So when you get to case control study, you will understand it better. So we are here. Okay, so when we want to estimate the incidence of disease, so the relative rate is calculated by estimating the incidence of disease among exposed and incidence of disease among non-exposed. So we pick the exposure status A over A plus B and divide it by C over C plus D to get the relative rate. So A over A plus B over C plus D, and that is the calculation for the relative rates. So there is a question here, you go and solve it. So you use the same formula. So A over A plus B, you read the question and go and solve later. So A over A plus B will give us what? The incidence among exposed. Then C over C plus D, or C over the total, or C over C plus D will give us incidence among non-exposed. So with that, we are coming to calculate the odds ratio for so we come here. So when we calculate, we say the incidence in the exposed over incidence over in the non-exposed will give us 19 over 158, 53 over 842. That's 0.120 divided by 0.063. Give us a relative risk of 1.9. I will explain. So 1.9, I'll come and explain this when we get there. So let's see 19. So the incidence in the exposed, let's look at it. Incidence in the exposed is 19 over 19 plus 139. So 19 over 19 plus 139. So 19, then 19 plus 139 will give us 158. So this one will give us 0.120. 53 over 53 plus 789. So we have over here we have 789. So 53 divided by 53 plus 789 will give us 0.063. Okay. So attributable risks. Attributable risks and attributable risks percent. So to calculate the attributable risks, one simply subtracts the risks for the non-exposed group from the risks for the exposed group. Thus, attributable risk is sometimes called the risk difference or excess risk. The excess risk is attributed to the exposure. So attributable risk meaning that we have we have the attributable risk P1 and PO. So the incidence in the exposed, that's the proportion of smokers with low birth weight infants, and proportion of non-smokers or those without the risks, without the exposure status. So if we have something like this, then we subtract 0.120 minus 0.063 will give us. So is that when you subtract this one, when you subtract 0.120, when you subtract the risks in the exposed in the non-exposed from the exposed one, then you get attributable risk. So let's see. So let's see. So this one we divided 0.120 divided by 0.063. But rather, if you divide, if you subtract instead of dividing, if we subtract this one from this one, will give us the attributable risk. Okay, so let's look. So you go and calculate the relative risk and attributable risk for the data above. And so let's go through quickly. So incidence of lung cancer among smokers, 70 over 7,000. So let's see. So here we have 70. When you add 70 plus 6, 9, 30 gives us 7,000. So 70 over 7,000 divided by 3 over 3,000. So we have 70 over 7,000. That's 10 per thousand. So if you cancel the 7 and the 7, give us 10 per thousand. Then 3 over 3,000 will give us 1 per thousand. So relative risk, that's the relative risk now becomes the 10 over 1,000, then the 1 per thousand. The 1,000 will cross each other, so we get 10 over 1, which is 10. Then if you want to find out lung cancer is 10 times more common among, so the explanation for the relative risk is that lung cancer is more common among smokers than non-smokers. Lung cancer is more common among smokers than non-smokers. So that is the relative risk. That is, lung cancer is tenfold more common, or tenfold increased in smokers than non-smokers. So that's the relative risk. So we have, if you want to find the attributable risk, then you just subtract, instead of dividing 10 over 1, you subtract 1 from 10 to get 90%. Like 10 minus 1 to get 9, then you multiply by 100 to get 90%. So the meaning of attributable risk is that 90% of the cases of lung cancer among smokers are attributed to their habit of smoking. So you want to now find out that this is what is causing this. So the smoking will rather cause 90% of people who smoke, their lung cancer is caused by smoking. So we attribute or infer causation that smoking leads to lung cancer. That is, 90% of people who smoke get lung cancer because of their smoking habits. Okay, so let's look at case control studies. We'll finish very soon. We are just left with just a few slides. The case control study, this is more practical but suffers from, please let me check on my recording and see.